Our relationship to the psychoanalytic thought of Sigmund Freud is, perhaps, best described as itself sublimely Freudian. On the one hand, Freud's thought is perfectly at home in how we describe ourselves, our relationships with one another, and our relationships with the world. We're quite comfortable with deploying concepts like libido, the unconscious, that we have drives, that we repress things, we engage in talk therapy, transference, projection. People are said to have complexes, anxiety, compulsions, and on and on. In fact, these concepts are so part of our language about the psyche that their very origins have become unconscious to us. It's as if we've always spoken in such terms when nothing could be further from the truth. Indeed, when we're confronted with the etiology of these terms and the theories and analytical practice of Freud, we recoil in horror and disgust as we dismissively blather on about how the pseudo-scientific, patriarchal, failed religion of psychoanalysis can be happily locked away in the oubliette of history. If that impulse isn't repression or our repulsion at these theories on an instance of transference, I'm not really sure what is. Freud, knowing that he was bringing us the plague, as he famously said, must have also known that we unhappily accept his discoveries because of something we profoundly detect in them that's true, but that we could only do so in maybe one of the most heroic social acts of repression of all times. Because, of course, if Freud is correct in any respect whatsoever, then our very modern vision of what we think we are disintegrates. This is perhaps nowhere more true, even among the true acolytes of psychoanalysis, than in the acceptance of Freud's most terrifying concept, the death drive. Rejected by the majority of analysts and philosophers, even avant-garde philosophers like Gilles Deleuze couldn't abide it at all. And even people like Lacan, actually, for them it became the central core to the Freudian doctrine itself. The death drive remains one of the most challenging and polarizing in all of Freud's metapsychological and philosophical thought. Though perhaps precisely because of how radical a concept it is, the death drive might also provide us a truly unique ability to grasp another deeply contested concept, that of the mystical. For that connection, I want to turn to one of the most controversial philosophers of all time, Georges Bataille, and how he conceived of the erotic, the festival, and religious sacrifice as the very mysticism of the death drive itself. This video is also pretty special because it's a collaboration with my dear friend and colleague Zevi over at Seekers of Unity. And now, if you're interested in mystics and the practice, and especially the philosophy behind mysticism, then you absolutely have to check out his channel. It's just stock full of amazing content. Zevi's going to be tackling Freud's relationship to mysticism more generally, and I'm going to be diving into this more darker, more esoteric implication of Freud's thought, especially vis-a-vis the death drive, as taken up by that greatest philosopher of the pornographic and the transgressive, Georges Bataille. So check out Zevi's episode for a firmer background on the psychoanalysis of mysticism vis-a-vis Freud, and make sure to subscribe to his fantastic channel. And of course, if you're interested in magic, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my content on numerous topics in esotericism, including curated playlists. And if you want to support work like this, making accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism for free here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting this work, this, I think, pretty interesting work, on Patreon. You can do that with a one-time donation or with the super thanks option below. You can find those options there in the pinned comment and in the description if you're interested. But now, let's turn to the dark ecstasies of the death drive, the erotic, and sacrifice. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. For the majority of Freud's intellectual career, he held that the psyche was a carefully synchronic balancing act between the unconscious drives of the id, the legal and moral impositions of the superego, with the ego caught in the tensions in between. Indeed, the ego might just be the nexus of those two tensions. This system was driven diachronically through developmental stages corresponding to sexual development and the accompanying complexes that emerge in that process, of course, with deleterious psychical structures emerging from the failure of the psyche to resolve tensions in that process. This diachronic and synchronic processual structure was all set into a meta-psychological theater of the pleasure principle on the one hand and its dialectical partner, the reality principle, on the other. Libidinal drives ever urging the organism towards pleasure, especially reproductive pleasure, with the reality principle negotiating the need to defer, transfer, and repress libido in the interests of long-term survival, and thus the birth of, well, rationality, or even the conscious sense of self as such. From the analysis of dreams to the developmental drama of genital identity and the series of familial complexes like the famed Oedipus complex, this system was highly capable of describing and treating the neuroses, hysterias, and compulsions that Freud and his acolytes encountered, well, up until about 1920, that is. So say what you want about Freud and his methods, at least he was willing to ask very deep, profound questions about even his own deeply held beliefs, even if he didn't give his disciples that same kind of latitude, admittedly, to question his own dogma when analytical experience called into question that very dogma. And by 1920, the kingdom ruled by the twin monarchs of the reality and the pleasure principles was absolutely coming apart. Freud had become perplexed by a specific form of repetition compulsion. Of course, repetition compulsions were already well attested in analytic experience, but these repetition compulsions were different precisely because they seemed not only inexplicable in terms of the pleasure principle, but they actively seemed to be undermining both the pleasure principle but also the reality principle, which, while it acted as a check on the pleasure principle, still acted in its long-term service. However, by this time, Freud had observed 3 repetition compulsions which actively sought out the inverse of pleasure, a compulsion to relive the very opposite of pleasure, the compulsion to repeat and relive one's own worst traumas. Freud observed this among soldiers returning from the First World War with what was then called shell shock or battle fatigue, what we now know of as an acute form of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. In that, their psyches seemed to relive the horrors of war despite their return from the unimaginable nightmare of the trenches. Further, even some patients' dream life was marked by reliving past traumas and recurring nightmares. This was diametrically opposed to Freud's conception of dreams as precisely a means to process and integrate unconscious desires. You shouldn't be reliving traumas in your dreams. Even such nightmares survived into conscious life of these patients, repeating sometimes physically and sensorially past traumas. Even his grandson's game of Fort Da, where he would play and replay both his own but his mother's disappearance, a total fracture in the Oedipal dynamics core to Freud's system. What could so violate the pleasure principle so as to compel people to relive the horror of trauma in both waking and dream life, but even in the play of children, the play that disappears their own mother? In short, there seemed to be a drive that existed outside or beyond the pleasure principle that could explain these horrible repetition compulsions. And it was in Freud's most daring and his most self-admittedly philosophical and speculative essay, the 1920 Beyond the Pleasure Principle, that he introduced his solution to this dilemma: the death drive. Here, Freud ventured into what has been called the metaphysics of biology, arguing that insofar as organic life emerged from inorganic life, there is a primitive compulsion built into every living cell to return to that previous homeostatic, inert state. That life itself is always in a state of tension with non-life, just as the psyche is just a series of tensions, and there must remain something of a resolution to those tensions. And Freud tends to actually use the term death drives for that resolution, which gravitates those very cells and in turn the organism itself toward a return to non-life and inorganic continuity. Thus, for Freud, there may very well be a kind of metaphysical masochism built into the very fundamental nature of life itself, which, being more primitive to the pleasure principle, seeks to and finally does outcompete the life drives. Now, this concept is not totally new to Freud, either philosophically or psychoanalytically. Sabina Spielrein, student, patient, and lover to Carl Jung, and a brilliant mind snuffed out by Nazi violence, may her blood be avenged, had published a similar concept in 1912, though Freud rejected the idea at the time as being too Jungian. Despite the apparent similarity between Spielrein and Freud's idea of the drives here, the death drive, even Spielrein's concept of a destructive drive was still conceived as fundamentally derivative of the pleasure principle, thus being actually, in fact, much closer to the orthodox position than the position that Freud would ultimately arrive at with the more fundamental and primitive conception of the death drive. Spielrein's destructive drive still served the pleasure principle, at least to some degree. Though, to his credit, Freud did acknowledge Spielrein's contribution to his thought on the death drive in a pretty famous footnote in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. However, the closest ancestor to Freud's death drive was not to be found in psychoanalysis at all, but in the philosophy of the infamous metaphysical pessimist, author Schopenhauer. In Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, he argued that the world as it appears to us is a mere representation of a fundamentally deeper reality, that of the thing in itself as pure will. This will is a metaphysically primitive, conative striving outside the mere representations of space or time, ontological diversity or difference, even prior to any sense of consciousness. It is an infinite drive in itself which can never be limited, exhausted, or satisfied. Thus, when the human being comes into existence as an expression of will, the drives of the individually instantiated human being are perpetually doomed to attempt to satisfy the primordial drive of will itself, drives which eventually propel the human subject as distinct from will itself back into the continuity of that very will which we were, which we are actually, and we will be again. Thus, only by ascetically rejecting our own will to life as distinct from the will itself can we quiet the desires on our part which leave us eternally suffering and bereft, finite, grinning marionettes driven by infinite will. Indeed, for Schopenhauer, it's primarily through the cultivation of the sense of the sublime in art, a rapturous, indeed unconscious state in which the subject is temporarily free of the will in a kind of unconscious aesthetic repose, that any respite from the ceaseless desiring can be had. It's also clear why Schopenhauer had such respect for Buddhism and ascetic Hinduism. Freud, for his part, would come to admit, both in private letters and in public lectures, the affinities of his newfound positions on the death drive with the philosophy, the pessimistic philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. However, Freud maintained that while the death drives were perhaps more primitive, the life drives were on equal footing once the organism had come into being, thus at some level rejecting or at least keeping a little bit of a skeptical distance from the more metaphysical positions of Schopenhauer on the will. Also, for what it's worth, Schopenhauer actually argued that occult forces and magic were proof of the existence of the will. That's a topic I'll be coming back to in a future episode. You betcha. Of course, Freud would continue to develop his concept of the death drive, deploying it most infamously in his 1930 Civilization and Its Discontents, where it would be used to describe the inherent tensions and aggressions of social life, thus barring the door to any utopian future of any kind. In his final years, Freud would actually inch closer to the position of Schopenhauer, even arguing that the goal of life was, in some real form, some metaphysical form, nothing other than death, a return to the vast, undifferentiated world of the unconscious and the inorganic. With the psychoanalytic Hierophant's death in 1939, the death drive would undergo a series of its own uncanny vicissitudes, with most analysts actually rejecting the death drive outright, and others, like Lacan, embracing it totally, even going so far as to make the pleasure principle and the other drives mere extensions or expressions of the death drives. However, it would be the philosopher of Transgression and colleague of Lacan, actually Lacan kind of stole his wife, so that's a thing, it would be Georges Bataille who would most fully integrate the concept of the death drive into the very core of his philosophy of eroticism and of religious mysticism. For Bataille, society generally and religion specifically turn on the management of a superabundant form of energy as excess, which must undergo ritual waste or sacrifice. This excess, which becomes poison, it spoils if it's stored too long, and it can't be traded. Its excess makes it a kind of non-commodity. It takes the form of a burden. This excess becomes a kind of burden. It's damned, so to speak, to be destroyed. Hence Bataille's discussion of this excess as the accursed share. How a society manages just that excess for Bataille is the defining feature of any given society, and he really focuses in his discussions on things like the Native American potlatch and various sacrificial systems like those found in the Hebrew Bible as central to social production and reproduction. For him, there are ultimately three natural mechanisms for a society to manage this excess, the accursed share. They can eat it, with this one species even consuming another. Our human excess typically can't be dealt with in this idea of the food chain, but even ritual cannibalism can be at work in this respect. Death in the form of sacrifice in war, that is to say we can dispose of the excess via sacrifice of war, and sexual reproduction, and this is the non-reproductive sexual expenditure in the form of eroticism and the production of children. Now, eroticism plus the production of children just starts the process all over again by way of displacement. For Bataille, sacrifice mediates the management of the accursed share between pure waste and consumption, and forms the central axis for societal identity and cohesion. We are how we sacrifice. Therefore, sacrifice for Bataille is the cornerstone of society and not some primitive practice which civilization will eliminate. In fact, in civilized society, it simply takes on a more barbaric and suicidal form. It just becomes war in the industrial level. Of ideas share with Freud. No longer would you destroy the accursed share. The excess is actually taken up by the rich in the form of capital through the exploitation of surplus labor value. So we reproduce society by the mass sacrifice of the producers of that very social excess in the forms of profit themselves. The proletariat have become the sacrificial victims, eternally caught in this system. Capitalism for Bataille means that humans sacrifice at a vast scale that never satisfies the desire for the destruction of that very excess. We sacrifice in capitalism, and we sacrifice it in a way that never satisfies us. Bataille's notion of sacrifice breaks with traditional conceptions of sacrifice, which merely understand it as a irrational or superstitious waste of valuable resources, or a attempt to use those scarce resources to appease violent supernatural forces. This conception of sacrifice, which you see overwhelmingly in literature, is the classic do ut des, where sacrifice is merely understood as a kind of mercantile exchange. For Bataille, this fundamentally misses the deeper inner logic, where sacrifice is the management of the accursed share. But to grasp this requires us to take a look at Bataille's deeper metaphysics, to take a look at his ontology. For Bataille, the non-human animal is radically immanent to its environment in that it doesn't interact with the world through subject-object relations. It's unconscious at some level. Only humans, through the mediation of tools, encounter themselves as subjects as distinct from the world around them as populated by objects. We gain consciousness, and this is kind of a tragedy for Bataille. Animal immanence gives rise to a world of transcendent objectivity through the application of tools to nature. Humans can and do extend their subjectivity to objects. I can begin to believe that other objects around me are subjects. First, tools are thought of as extensions of the subject, and Bataille argues that human beings extend their subjectivity to eventually to being itself, the lost continuity of immanence. They miss the world of immanence and therefore make immanence itself subjective. This subjectivization of immanence comes to constitute the being supreme over all others. It becomes a kind of God. Within this realm of pure ontological continuity as immanence, all beings lose their individual identity and return to their primordial animality or primordial inorganic reality. Their collapse back into this vast oneness of being. This threat to our subjectivity, it's that radical immanence destroys us as individuals, and yet it's a promise, it's an allure, there's an eroticism. Immanence is an alluring in its serene continuity. This forms the encounter with the supreme being, but because the sacred is simultaneously terrible and alluring, it has to be contained, it has to be quarantined, as if it were contagious. We are allured by the promise to return to pure continuity, pure being, and yet we cling to our subjectivity, and it's the sacrifice that mediates that dialectic. This contagious quality of the sacred, the terrible and yet alluring encounter with the immanence of pure being, is contained in general by this festival, but specifically revealed and suppressed through the act of sacrifice. The human being, as you might imagine, is genuinely unwilling to throw themselves into certain annihilation of self-sacrifice. That's the pleasure principle. But through the death of a substitute, a sacrifice, one can both encounter the pure immanence of life. Death reduces the animal or the other object of the accursed share to destruction, reducing everything transcendent about it that leaves behind simply pure life in the dying breath of that animal. But also this quarantine through the encounter with immanence, of course through fastidious systems of rules which govern when, how, who may do so, etc. of the sacrificial instance, through the structure of the festival. The sacrifice manages the accursed share by systematically purging it as a way of allowing for and yet denying an encounter with the immanence of being. And he argues that the sacrifice has three features in this process. The first is that the temporality of the sacrifice is radically of a moment in which past and future compress into an eternal instant. This is the encounter with the unconscious, non-dual rejection of subject-object duality, with temporality becoming a constant present. Sacrifice only knows the present, the temporality of the moment between life and death. Secondly, it mediates between utility. The sacrifice is removed from the realm of objects, tools, and means, ends, relations in the moment of sacrifice, and waste. A pure sacrifice is totally destroyed, though parts of it could be used for other sacred or aspect of use cut off from the realm of mundane subject-object relations. Third, the sacrifice acts to mediate between radical intimacy, the destruction of the individual through the collapse of subject-object relations, and alienation, the strict separation of subjects as orphaned off into the realm of cold, indifferent objects. By extension, eroticism and mystical union function in the exact same logic for Bataille as sacrifice. Both are born from the nostalgia for pure being, ontologically prior to the subject-object distinction, such that erotic nakedness, for instance, is that first return to animality, the little death of orgasm, a deletion of consciousness, or the union with the divine in raptured ecstasy, precisely that, the annihilation of the self as such, a drop of water into the oceanic abyss of being. For Bataille, that nostalgia for pure immanence, Freud's death drive, is the driving force for societal organization, from the ritual waste of the festival, the productive of the sacred itself, to the ecstatic breakdown and breakthrough of the mystic beyond subjectivity to union with the one, to the erotic encounter where the body of the self and the lover vanish into some kind of totality beyond all pain and pleasure. So, to summarize, sacrifice for Bataille is the use of the accursed share, the necessarily produced excess of a society, to encounter the sacred immanence of pure being without falling back into animality or complete self-destruction, or societal destruction for that matter. Or, as he puts it, sacrifice is just the production of the sacred itself. Given all this, it's unsurprising to see why his philosophy and pornography actually ceaselessly orbit notions of violence, pain, and excess as inherently quasi-mystical. They are at the limit of experience whereby one sacrifices oneself as enmeshed in subject-object relations for the joy of at least temporary annihilation. Sacrifice, from the destruction of the accursed share in the festival to the limited experience of pure eroticism, is for Bataille the only way to the sacred. And I think it should be relatively obvious that Bataille's theory of religion, mysticism, the sacred, as the product of sacrifice and eroticism, all have Freud's death drive as their core component. For Bataille, the death drive takes the form of just that nostalgia from the continuity of pure pre-human existence mediated by tools and the subject-object distinction, but also a thirst for annihilation itself, which is played out in both religious mysticism, but also in the inherent, even ontological sadomasochism of eroticism. Of course, I can't help but think of the festival of Halloween, even in its rather denatured form today, as an expression of precisely the pleasure we receive in this play between life and death, horror and beauty, the allowed and the transgressive. And even more than Bataille's own lurid and sometimes campy experiments with pornography, I think that Clive Barker's The Hellbound Heart, if you want a real Bataillean death drive novel with sacrifice and eroticism built into it. The Hellbound Heart, the inspiration for the Hellraiser series, as you probably know, perfectly captures this Freudian Bataillean confluence of pain, pleasure, beauty, desire, repulsion, sacrifice, and the ecstasy that only horror can provide. Again, make sure to check out Zevi's companion episode to this one. There's a reading list and a description if you want to dive into Death Drive and Bataillean metaphysics. And again, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to subscribe. Consider supporting my work on Patreon, a one-time donation, or maybe with super thanks option. I really do appreciate your consideration of supporting Esoterica. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.